Hi, everyone, and welcome to DASER Experiments, a conversation with Jennifer Jacquet and James Prosek. I'm J.D. Tolosik. I'm the Director of Cultural Programs with the National Academy of Sciences, and we're so glad that you're able to join us today. So you might ask, what is a DASER? Well, DC Art Science Evening Rendezvous has been hosted by CPNAS for almost 10 years. In our physical space, we brought together experts across disciplines and across sectors to promote conversation that can lead to collaborations and integrative learning and thinking. Now in our virtual space, we are experimenting with ways to continue this practice with each DASER experiment learning and informing the next one. DASERs are created in partnership with an international network of similar salons organized by Leonardo, the International Society of Art, Science, and Technology. And today, we are also glad to welcome another partner, Issues in Science and Technology. This is a journal that is co-published by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine and Arizona State University. For over 10 years, CPNAS has collaborated with Issues to incorporate the use of contemporary artwork to create a sort of a cultural counterpoint to the topics within the magazine. One of the things that our two guests today have in common, James Prosek and Jennifer Jacquet, is that they are both contributors to the next edition of Issues, the summer edition. So let me introduce to you our two guests. James Prosek wears many hats, artist and writer and naturalist. He has a long history of exhibitions, including a current exhibit at the Yale University Art Gallery. He has authored a number of books, and he has contributed to publications such as the New York Times, National Geographic, and many others. A common thread that flows throughout James's work in both writing and art is that he challenges us to think about the way naming constructs impacts the way that we think about the world around us. In fact, his contribution to Issues focuses on just that with his article, Naming Nature. Joining James in conversation is scientist Jennifer Jacquet. Jennifer's book, Is Shame Necessary?, explores strategies that could impact social reform and environmental policy. Jennifer is a professor in the Department of Environmental Studies at New York University, and she's a recipient of an Alfred P. Sloan Fellowship. She co-authored an article in Issues called The Great Fish Pain Debate, and we'll hear more about that shortly. The first part of the conversation, as we'll see, is pre-recorded, and we do this for two reasons. One, to reduce technological barriers such as screen sharing or PowerPoints, but to also sort of create in the DASER space several layers of engagement. You see, Jennifer and James are both live, and they're in the virtual green room. They can answer your questions during and, of course, after the video is completed. So, we will use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and you can start asking questions at any time. Those of you who have been in our live DASER know that we do something called a community share, where anyone in the audience can briefly introduce themselves, share their collaborative or integrative and creative work, or simply say hi. And so we're going to encourage you to do this today in the Zoom chat feature. So questions go to Q&A, and introductions and community share go through the chat Zoom. Both of those features are located at the bottom of your screen. About halfway through the program, the video will conclude, and Jennifer and James will join us live, and we'll continue to answer your questions in real time.
I'd always been interested in a kind of interdisciplinary approach to globalized problems that were beyond the scope of a single country being able to solve them, or even a handful of countries, that where you really needed global cooperation. And that's why I continue to study climate change, overfishing, and the wildlife trade, which I know James is also really interested in and is such a thorny problem. And then in 2012, I moved to New York University, and I'm now part of the sort of new Department of Environmental Studies there, which again takes this real systems approach and highly interdisciplinary approach to environmental problems. And I consider myself, if I compare myself to my PhD supervisor, who I would say over the course of his career sort of had an awakening to conservation problems and, the Anthropocene that we were living in, I would say I very much was born into that tradition already. I didn't have to learn about it. I feel like as a child growing up, I understood that environmental problems were going to be one major characterization of the era I was living through. And that struck me as something that I would be interested in fighting for, working on, understanding better, in the same way that I think if I was, born in the 20s, I would have been a suffragette, or if I had been born in the 60s, I would have been fighting for, or growing up in the 60s, would have been fighting for civil rights. And so I find myself very much involved with environmental activism and to some extent animal activism.
My name is James Prosek, and I grew up in southwestern Connecticut in a town called Easton. I live 2 houses down from the house where I grew up, so I have a strong sense of place. And I've watched this immediate environment around me for 45 years. That's how old I am. I was introduced to nature through my father and his love of birds primarily. He grew up in Brazil, and when he moved to this country, he brought that love of birds with him. He would bring me out in the fields and the woods and the marshes and with field guides, and we'd learn the names of the local animals and plants and things. And I developed a deep love of the natural world. And so I've been drawing my whole life and keeping a journal since I was 11. So the process of drawing and writing have always been very important to me. At about 9 years old, I fell in love with fishing, and I fell in love with fish. I don't know exactly why, but in particular, a fish of fragile cold water ecosystems called a trout. Our native trout in Connecticut, the brook trout, is actually its closest ancestor is the Arctic char. So they're a relic of the last glaciation, and they love cold, clean waters, which are disappearing fast. So a lot of native trout around the world, their habitats are disappearing because of climate change, overfishing, pollution, a lot of the same problems that Jennifer spoke about and has been confronting since she was young. My first book was a book of paintings of the trout of North America. Basically, as a kid, I went to the library, this was before the internet, looking for a book on the trout of North America, and I couldn't find one in the library. So I thought at 10 or 11 years old, I'll make a book on the trout of North America. So I started compiling a list of all the trout of North America. There was an important kind of revelation or turning point in my research as a kid when I realized that no two biologists could agree on how many species or subspecies or varieties of trout there were, char or whatever you might want to call them. And so I came to this realization that not only could they not agree on how many species there were, but they couldn't agree on what a species even was. And so at the same time, my father, who also had a love of art and poetry, was reading some of these popular evolutionary biologists at the time, E.O. Wilson and Stephen Jay Gould. And so he was always talking about evolution. He was also happened to be a science teacher in the local neighboring town, Trumbull. He taught astronomy and earth science. So I was learning about evolution from him, just talking about how the world came about. So it kind of was the start of a lifelong inquiry that I'm still kind of deeply immersed in about how and why we name and order the natural world. We need to take the natural world and chop it in pieces and label the pieces in order to communicate. But I think through conditioning, it sets up an idea when you teach nature that way, that nature is divided up in neat units that fit in boxes. And we have this very fragmentary view of nature when really nature's not like that at all. Something you said, Jennifer, was interesting to me, that you came to environmental activism or interest in how we're treating the environment because it was the problem of the time, but that if you'd grown up in another time, then maybe it would have been something else. But I think also you probably have a natural inclination to loving nature in some way, right? Or do you really think that's absolutely true, or do you think you have a predilection towards, liking organisms and stuff? It
Fighting.
seems like reading some of your work about octopuses and stuff that maybe it's compassion that drives or empathy that drives your work, but I just want to dig a little deeper into that comment you made.
No, thanks. I mean, I think there is some obvious contrast between us. So for instance, that you've sort of stayed where you've grown up and you have a real relationship, I think, to the place. And I feel like I am, as an individual, a manifestation of globalization with no rooting anywhere. I mean, really no place that I would call home. And to your point about then my relationship to nature, I've had moments through my life, especially through my 20s, where I was really building that strong relationship. But I made an active choice, basically when I decided to start a PhD, that I would go full on into the kind of intellectual domain, the ideas and the kind of the space where I felt like a lot of normative, prescriptive, a fight for nature was happening, which was no longer the sort of like tying yourself to the tree or being a Sea Shepherd volunteer, but was about putting forth ideas that I felt like where you could, draw a line in the sand and figure out which side you were on.
Right.
And so, I live normally to whatever extent I do, but in New York City, in Lower Manhattan, I'd say as remote from nature as any, as any city dweller out there. And yet I find myself fighting for this cause that is actually fairly abstract to me.
I read the introduction to your shame book, and it started with a really fun anecdote. And I remember the cans, how there was an activist who shamed the tuna industry into changing their fishing practices so that they're not killing as many dolphins or porpoises. And then the, Star-Kissed and the other brands came out with this dolphin-free label. And then all the consumers that were concerned are like, oh, we can eat tuna fish again. But then I think you realize it wasn't that simple.
I sort of think the reason why I draw the parallel to the suffragettes or the civil rights movement is because I was motivated by a sense of injustice that I think characterized those periods as well. And of course, those battles are still ongoing. But for me, when I saw the photo that you're referring to, I got from the Earth Island Institute in the mail when I was a kid of, I'd written to them on the basis of this book, 50 Simple Things Kids Can Do to Save the Earth. They sent me back the dolphins that were being slaughtered on board the tuna boats. And I think at that moment, I was like, this is a severe injustice that's occurring toward dolphins. I still wasn't primed to think really about the tuna. And I thought, okay, we have to do something about this. And the point I'm making in my book, and I think that I've been grappling with through my career, is yes, I have this connection with the animals or with the nature, but then the bigger question of the kind of strategic ideas or the frameworks or, the marketplace of ideas that we're operating in, how does that affect how we think we can change the world? And what I have come to grapple with quite a bit is that I was encouraged to change the world as a consumer. And I resent that a little bit.
Do you remember that moment?
Yeah, I think of Swordfish a Break campaign. I mean, one thing that's been interesting is to look at how these even local boycotts then are really ineffective in the face of globalization, because there's another marketplace that will take the swordfish, right? If you have a boycott on the East Coast of the US, now we can move goods really quickly. There was a period where that wasn't true, and this is with our interconnected markets and the internet and real-time information now. It's almost that even those effective boycotts are being overridden by the process of, new markets on the other side of the world. One thing I wanted to ask you, or at least ask how much you deal with on your sort of day to day. I've always been, we talk about that image, right, that Sam Labuddy captured of the dolphin being caught in the tuna net. And that single image, right, sort of changed my relationship with that issue. And I've always been jealous of artists and photographers for being able to convey an idea, or being able to convey in so quickly, in an instant, really.
Right.
And so I'm curious how much you think about that when creating your work.
When I was working on the first book I did, which is a book of paintings of the trout of North America, I was completely obsessed with fly fishing. I would make these little artificial flies that imitate insects, you know, the forage of the trout with fur and feathers, and tie them to a hook. And I'd go down to my local stream and try to catch the fish. I would go out with these little imitations of nature. And the remarkable thing about fishing for a trout or any animal is that you cast this little imitation of nature you made out in the stream. And if the fish acknowledges it as looking like an insect, it'll change its sort of regular routine, its daily routine eating actual things, and it'll steer its attention toward this little thing you've made that exists in a secondary imitation or world of mimicry. And if it eats it, then, if it even looks at it, but if it eats it, then that fly is essentially a translation device between the mind of a human and the mind of a fish. You're actually communicating with that animal. And that's the kind of connection that I wanted with these fish. I didn't know it, like how to describe it or why I desired it so deeply, but I think it's a legacy of this long relationship we've had with animals, where we have to, unfortunately, kill them sometimes to sustain ourselves. But I always let the fish go. But I love these fish, to get to the point. I love these fish so much that I knew in my local stream, and I spent so much time down there, that I knew fish not just as like a brook trout, like a species, but I knew them as individuals. I would photograph every single fish that I caught and let them go. And over the years, I started looking at the pictures, and I was like, that's the same fish. I could recognize it. They all have a unique spotting pattern, which is like a fingerprint. And so I knew the fish not just as members of a species, but as individuals. And to me, they were as different as, you know, myself and my father and my sister or my mother were. And so that made me think about nature on another level. And so at the same time that I was catching the fish, I was drawing them. And drawing also increased the sort of intimacy that I had with the fish, because when you draw something, you're really forced to look at it closely. So years later, I decided I wanted to do a book of paintings of a handful of ocean fishes. So I chose 35 ocean fish that are popular commercially and recreationally. And I wanted to paint them. Unfortunately, for the book, they have to be reduced. But the idea was to paint them life-size and exhibit them, you know, not just any life-size swordfish or blue marlin, but an individual fish that I had a personal experience with. But for me and my purposes, unfortunately, it was better to see the fish alive in the water and then dead, because I could measure it and look at it, watch the colors as they faded from life to death, and try to capture that moment. Can you make change happen through photography or paintings? For me, those paintings didn't take an instant. They took, you know, months to make sometimes, and also trips to, like I spent 8 days on a harpoon boat in Nova Scotia on George's Bank to see a swordfish in its living colors. A problem with sort of capturing that in some cases is that, like, a swordfish has these unreal colors on the back, and you really can't capture them.
I'm struck, I think I read something in your work too about this line between art and artifact that you're interested in. And of course, your accounts of, the swordfish colors fade quickly, and those mimic a lot of early historical accounts of bird kills, right?
Yeah.
The plumes are not and there's a kind of history of killing animals both for consumption. Sometimes it's necessary, a lot of times it isn't. And for artifact,
right,
where it is this kind of fascination and love that ultimately, as we know, like a lot of the last of a species were killed for artifact purposes, or held in a zoo, in a captive, the last passenger pigeon died in a zoo.
I became really interested in in a fish called the freshwater eel. The trout is considered one of the most beautiful fish, and the eel is considered one of the ugliest. And a lot of the people who are supporters of my work are like, "What are you doing? This is, no one's going to hang a picture of an eel over their mantle." It's like career suicide. But I couldn't stop thinking about this fascinating fish. There's eels in the pond across the street from my house that were born in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in the Sargasso Sea. So it's this fish that ties the ocean and the rivers together in this huge interconnected system. And that's, I think, what I've become most interested in is interconnectivity, and how everything we do has a consequence somewhere else. And my pure love of these animals has made me by default an activist. I didn't wake up and say I'm going to be an activist. It happened naturally, because when you start seeing resources being diminished before your eyes, you're just like, this is crazy. I mean, what can we do to stop this?
So it seems like you have come through your own personal experiences, which is, I think, very common, to new views of these animals and their kind of place in the world. And of course, by observing things around you. And this also, I mean, again, in the kind of work that I do, I'm interested. We hosted an event at NYU called Seeing Seafood as Animals. So even when you're using the term resources, it kind of makes my hair stand up a little bit, because you, on the other hand, you kept talking about them as animals, right? So
right.
That's not the same thing. Like if, you're a coal mine and the coal is a resource to make energy versus an individual organism with its own agency, wants, needs, desires, curiosity, pain, whatever the case may be. And you also mentioned that recreational fishing, you have a different relationship than you had with it at the beginning, which seemed largely driven by your own curiosity and the kind of shared experience that you had with the individual trout. But also, as you said, a kind of fetishization or, ability to get your hands around these animals, right? Which I think is very, especially when you're 10 years old in a stream, a very natural thing to feel.
Yeah.
The article that we have coming out in Issues is very much, I've been immersed in and kind of bumping up against the fish pain debate for so long. And what we did was I worked with a person who specializes in fish welfare as well as a historian to just track the history of the science of the fish pain debate. So very different thing than the science in and of itself. And I think what you'll find interesting about the piece is that all of the fish pain conversation really is the result, or the vast majority is a quirk in German law about catch and release fishing. So catch and release is introduced to Germany. The animal rights activists don't like it. And there's a new, as well, animal welfare law that is interpreted as catch and release actually being a bad thing for fish. Now, if you caught it and ate it, you were fine. But the catch and release, the kind of sport of it was seen as unjust by some animal rights activists. But the thing that is so fascinating to me is that you have the subject of fish pain, the study of it, circling around angling almost entirely. So like the experimentation is almost all on hooks and mouths. When if you are someone like me that thinks about, seafood as animals more broadly, a hook in the mouth is like one of 1,000 negative experiences that a fish might encounter. And it's also, it's kind of like, it's not the most likely negative experience that a fish will encounter. And if you think also angling kills maybe millions of fish per year, whereas you're talking about billions being killed through aquaculture or trillions being killed through industrial fisheries. And yet the science stays sort of in this gyre of the angling framework. And so I think you will find it interesting just for a kind of weird quirk of how a scientific field builds and sort of stays contained to this one domain of experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're right to be critical of the way I discuss things. It's because my whole life, I've been examining the way that I talk about things and the words that I use. And I think the words are important. You take a word like resource, I think resource still has value. Not value, but communication value, only because some of these animals are seen as resources. Like I'm working on an article for National Geographic right now about the Gulf of Maine, which is a huge body of water, basically starts in Cape Cod all the way up along the coast of New Hampshire, Maine to Nova Scotia. The main thrust of the story is that the warming waters in the Gulf of Maine is going to essentially eliminate the lobster fishery in maybe 60, 80 years because the waters will be too warm. The lobsters just keep moving north. The same fishery that is happening in the Gulf of Maine, which is the most lucrative fishery in North America, over $500 million a year, the lobster fishery in Maine will be moving like 200, 300 miles north into Canada because the warmer waters will be too warm for successful spawning of the lobsters. But if you don't call it a resource because it's an economic resource, what word do you use? I mean, I want to know because I want to use the right terminology. I mean, what word wouldn't make you cringe if you heard it to describe a fishery? Or
yeah, I mean, and
I
by
only
no
say that
means
that's the way we look at it.
exactly. Well,
And I'm not saying that that's something I agree with, but how do you change the conversation with one word?
So, I mean, yeah, thanks for being so open to it. So we actually have a paper submitted and under review called Seeing Seafood as Animals, which is exactly what you're asking for, making suggestions for alternative words. So not just for resource. I mean, I think we should just call them aquatic animals or wild aquatic animals or farmed aquatic animals, because the term resource lumps too many species, individuals, whatever together anyway.
Well, I totally agree, but how do you describe the fact that it's an economic resource without using the word resource? If you call it a fishery, that's almost just as bad. I mean, in an article, like, how would I circumvent that?
Well, I think a fishery
problem?
I think a fishery is correct, and even resource can be correct, but it's not the sole way that you want to refer. And even it's clear in your own thinking, it doesn't reflect the full bodied nature of how you feel about these animals. You know, we're making the argument that seafood or aquatic animals, more than any other group of animals,
Well, even seafood implies that it's a food for us. I mean, how do we eliminate seafood? I mean, any of these words are problematic if you examine them enough.
Yep, and the word seafood is really problematic. We've already encountered it in our conversation where it's suggested that this is necessary sustenance, when in fact a lot of these animals are destined for luxury markets where it's really not about food security. It's not, about 3% of global fish catch is actually subsistence fishing. And then there's, a lot of small scale fishing that's about another quarter, but then about 3/4 of the global fish catch is actually globalized traded commodity.
Oh yeah, it's industrial.
There is no relationship. An industrial longliner is not, as you say, they don't even see the colors of the fish. There isn't this relationship with the hunting.
Well, they still, in the defense of the fishermen, and I am 1,000%, 1,000,000% against longlining because it's one of the worst possible ways to harvest fish. But the fishermen out on these boats, they know their resource. If they don't know their resource, they're burning thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars in fuel on every fishing trip. They know the fish as well as the fishermen in Galilee knew their environments, and they are intimate with their environments. It's not just a livelihood, it's a cultural thing as much as any cultural thing is on the planet. And I feel like the conversations aren't being had, and people without experiential knowledge should try at least to get a little bit by going out on a long line boat if they're allowed. I mean, it's not easy to get on a commercial boat, but
just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting they don't have an intimate knowledge of nature per se, but when you're talking about the term resource, I mean, coal miners have a very good sense of where coal is. Also, a factory trawler has a very good understanding of where shrimp are. I'm not suggesting they don't know that. Of course, that's how they make an economic living. I'm suggesting the relationship with the individual animals is really different. And it is different in part because of its industrial nature.
Yeah, it's terrible. The fact that we're even having this discussion is really important. And as we talk, we work out the kinks in what we want to say and what we want to convey. But our missions are the same, which is basically to have a world that's better, and more healthy.
I am interested in these kind of new opportunities. So my friend Becca and collaborator on this piece, you know, she sent me this amazing video of the above pond aquarium, it's called. And it's basically, you take an aquarium, you put it on a pond, and then you vacuum the water so that it rises up. So that actually now the fish have the choice whether or not they come up or stay submerged.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of them choose to come up and explore and look around at humanity, to your point, to their observers, you know, and now it's a shared experience. So I decided to start looking around at sort of problems that seemed on the horizon. And one that I found that came across my desk actually was written a little article in The Conversation about how we were close to being able to get commercial octopus farming off the ground. And I thought, okay, here's the thing I want to argue against, because I don't think that we should just let the technology dictate our decisions to unleash new kinds of factory farming, essentially. And I think we should have a robust ethical discussion. And as part of that, we wrote a piece in Issues in Science and Technology that was very clear, I think, on our stance, the case against octopus farming. In Issues, there was this wonderful artwork by Judy Fox that sort of put octopus in a kind of alternative domain, right? They were sculptures. It was a black background. It was kind of almost this tabula rasa about what do you want to feel about these animals. But in the popular media, they were using all of these images of octopus floating on a reef. And I was like, wait a minute. I don't think this would, to our point earlier in the conversation about how quickly an image can convey an idea, I didn't feel like that was a good match for the idea, which was, if we're talking about commercial octopus farming, we're not talking about an octopus happily floating along on a reef. And so that's when, to your point, James, I collaborated with these artists that I had already worked with to build a website for my book, who use algorithmic techniques to create a kind of often dystopian aesthetic. So I thought they were perfect for the task. And they created the image that you saw, that you, as you say, fell for.
I was interested in the article too, because you base some of your thoughts on why octopus farming would be not so good on the fact that they seem to have an intelligence that's something more than other things that we farm. And you touched on if we had to farm octopuses, if the demand was there and we could do it technologically, what would be the best way to do it?
This is an opportunity to say, do we want this industry at all? I mean, what do we need it for exactly?
Well, we can probably block it in the US, but how would we prevent it from happening in a country where we don't have control?
Well, in fact, most of it is not in the US at all. It's Spain and its diaspora are funding most of the commercial pursuits, of course, a little bit in China, a little bit in Japan. But the start of any conversation like this does begin with two sides, at least. And there was only one side up until that point. I am the only person to have written another article in favor of farming bivalves, but against farming cephalopods. So this is like very strange if you look at the phylum Mollusca, because I'm saying, hey, we should go this direction. And it also speaks to what you're interested in, this crazy divergent evolution, where actually we would argue that if you look at those same criteria of food security and ecological ethics and animal welfare, bivalves likely minimize the harms in those and maximize food security in those kind of domains. And I added some photos, but even for that article too, I thought strategically, bivalves are normally sort of lackluster as an image, you have to admit. And so I hired a chef I know and a photographer I know, and we put together photos for that piece as well that are not dystopian or anything, but actually trying to sort of sex bivalves up. Last question for you, James. Have you ever drawn a bivalve of any sort?
Yes, I have. I've drawn clams and oysters and mussels. If you ever need any
definitely might call on you.
art,
yeah.
But no, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, it's been great chatting, and I love seeing your studio. I think you should show the audience your floor.
Well, this is, I turned the lights out so they wouldn't be in people's eyes, but I live kind of near nature. I don't know if you can see out the window, but there's a field out there. But yeah, this is where I work, and this is a desk. But the floor has become kind of a desk in itself.
I love it.
And yeah, so it's worked for me.
It's really beautiful. I can see why you're inspired there. Wonderful.
Well, yeah, it's been a real pleasure, and I hope we get to meet and hang out maybe with JD.
Perfect.
And JD, thanks for getting us together.
Welcome and thank you for the delightful conversation to both of you. Thanks for being here and contributing this. I just want to jump in with some of the questions from the audience. We had we had asked people to submit questions beforehand as well as through the Q&A today. And one of the questions that came up in several different fashions is to talk a little bit more about the concept of fish pain. What exactly is it that we are talking about with fish pain? Are we talking about, agony? What's the scientific evidence that fish feel pain? Also, as humans, why should we care about fish pain? So, Jennifer, maybe we could start with you. We did offer a link so that people could read the fish pain debate online, but for those of us who might not have had a chance to read it, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what is the debate.
Yeah, thanks, JD. Jumping right into that, that's the sort of hook, I guess, that drew us to this whole performance today. And to be clear, I am not somebody who studies fish pain directly, but as I say, I had been encountering the fish pain debate regularly. I was at a conference on consciousness in animals at NYU, hosted by the philosophy department mainly. And there was still a debate about fish pain, and it's been ongoing for 50 years. And I was sort of thinking, wow, we don't debate whether or not birds can feel pain, kind of constantly in this same way. And I just started getting interested in the history of the science and the sociology of the science. And as I mentioned, I think in the pre-recording, that necessitates working across disciplinary boundaries, which is something that I always am game to do anyway. So we teamed up with this historian and a fish welfare person. We dug into this history, which begins in apartheid South Africa, really with the statements that fish are more primitive animals. I mean, this is why I think it links so well to the kind of work that James does as well. The idea that fish are somehow primitive or less evolved is really kind of deep in our psyche, deep in this conversation. Yet, of course, if we think about it, for even 2 minutes, we realize they've been evolving, facing the same, natural selection that we have for these thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And so the debate goes something like this. On one side, the argument is fish are primitive, and then neuroscience kind of interjects there and brings up the point that fish lack a neocortex. Now, keep in mind, birds also lack a neocortex that's similar to a mammal. And then on the other side of the debate are a bunch of scientists who really test, basically inflict pain on fish and look at their responses. It starts with actually a lot of experiments on eels, James, that you're talking about the eel as a sort of disregarded species in Germany, and then a bunch of other experiments to follow. And almost all of them, the conceit of pain is about a hook in their mouth. Like or they inject a bit of bee venom into their lip. And so it's just, to me, it's so interesting that the science, again, sort of circulates around this framework around angling, as I already mentioned. And so if you dig into the history, so sometimes science has genuine debates forever about various issues, and some taxonomic issues are like that. And sometimes scientific debates are really about social values, or there's a mix of the science and the social values. And this is certainly one of those cases where the science has been so informed by the political and ideological debates that are going on. And that always interests me. I mean, you almost can't escape that if you work on environmental or animal issues.
James, I wonder if you have a perspective. I know one of the other questions that came up is, how do you talk to fishermen friends about fish pain? But I wonder if, given your life and your experience as an artist and a writer, you've thought about this. What's your take on the question?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I would imagine that fish do feel pain if a hook is, stuck in their mouth or their jaw. And as Jennifer said, we're all sort of related. I mean, humans diverged from fishes, I think, 400 million years ago or so, or mammals. As a kid, I was obsessed with fishing, and I never really gave it a thought. I mean, because I caught fish and I released them, and I knew that most of them survived because I had such an intimate relationship with my local stream that I caught the same individual fish. I would catch the same individual fish multiple times over the course of a year. I could identify them by their spotting patterns, which I obsessively photographed and logged and stuff. So, like a fingerprint. But angling is a very big, important pastime economically. I'm sure there's a big lobby behind it. So it'd be hard to get rid of recreational angling, let alone commercial fishing. But I can say that I fish recreationally a lot less than I did when I was, I would say, 9 to 22 are my peak years of fishing, and I probably fish a handful of times a year now. And part of it is maybe that I don't want to bother the fish as much. For me, a lot of my interest in fishing for trout was research for the paintings I was making, and there was no substitute for actually seeing the fish in its living colors right when it came out of the water. And one of the only ways to do that was by catching them with a rod and line. I did get deeply into fly fishing, which, as I mentioned in the discussion, is a kind of communication with the fish, because the fly is this imitation of nature, is essentially a translation device that allows the brain of a human and the brain of a fish to connect. So that's a really kind of amazing moment. But you can achieve that without hooking the fish, and some people have actually started cutting the barb and the J part of the hook off the fly, and they'll just cast the imitation of the insect, and the fish will take it, and then it just pops out of their mouth because there's no hook. So that's one way to get your angling fix without actually causing pain to the animal. I mean, it's not just the pain in the mouth, but the being dragged through the water, fighting, against the rod, but then also being taken out of the water. It's essentially probably like dunking a human under the water without their consent. And so, yeah, it's problematic, but there's a flip side to angling, which Jennifer and I talked about at one point in the discussion. I think it was edited out, where anglers are good conservationists and stuff. But Jennifer, I didn't get a chance to read your article because it wasn't available when we had our discussion, but would you, or I don't know if you've commented on this, do you advocate banning recreational fishing, or how do you feel about that kind of thing?
No, I mean, for us, it really is an examination of the science and the history and sociology of the science. So again, I think what interests me is when you say, oh, how do you talk to fishermen? I mean, most fishermen are not concerned about fish pain, I think, at all, because it's sort of a moot point in a lot of ways. I think where people got interested in fish pain was a result of this legislation that threatened certain economic livelihoods and certain kinds of pastimes. And to me, it's just so interesting that here we have this giant industrial fishing complex. We have aquaculture, where far more individuals are sort of harmed each year. But the conversation around pain and fish, again, just sticks to this issue of angling and catch and release. And there are very political reasons for that. And I just find that fascinating as someone interested in science, as someone friends with many scientists who are doing even this kind of work, the way that the social structures and the social conversations funnel the science through a particular lens. So the article is in no way prescriptive. I mean, I think all of my co-authors and I do err on the side that fish are very likely to feel pain, but that's sort of the extent of the prescriptive side. It's really a history and sociology of the science.
I'm gonna, there's a lot of questions coming in, and I would like to be able to try to consolidate some of these. There's a number regarding sort of the relationship between artists and scientists, and I think that the conversation that we've had with you kind of illuminates that the reality that the benefits of talking across disciplines can really change a perspective or enlighten a perspective. So to sort of combine a lot of these questions, what advice or direction would either one of you give, say, for artists who want to develop a relationship with environmental scientists, or vice versa, scientists that want to develop a relationship with artists?
Jennifer, you want to go first? All right.
Well, so one instance in the pre-recording that I think, James, you were saying, oh, it doesn't take you an instinct to create the work. So by no means, I think many of these works, the images or the films, they take, sometimes a lifetime to produce, but the consumption of them. So it's like, I've looked at your trout work, but you haven't read my fish pain debate because of the time demands, right, of engaging. Now, it's not to say that you shouldn't engage longer with art than many of us do, or with images in general. But for me, I think that we'll continue to see these things in a more continuous fashion. We already have seen through history the breakdown between sort of arts and science, and I'm not very talented in that regard, but I think from the beginning that I started doing the work I did, that I've done, engaged with artists who are interested in these subjects. So my PhD supervisor coined the term, or would talk about how the future of seafood is going to be jellyfish burgers, if we keep fishing the way we are. And I thought, why don't we have an image of a jellyfish burger? Because this is such a salient, easy way for people to understand sort of the potential stakes of our current overexploitation. And so I teamed up with actually my boyfriend in 5th grade, who's now an artist. We made a jellyfish burger together, and I feel like that's just really fun, and it's a really great way of challenging yourself, as I was mentioning with the case against octopus farming, to try to imagine what kind of image really does reflect your idea, and not just leave it to the hands of, I don't know, the Guardian or whoever may be writing about your work. So I think all that you really need is the interest. And then I feel like there are so many people I've encountered, at least, who are game to work together on creating this stuff for very little, if not no, financial benefit.
And James, what's your perspective?
Yeah,
you've worked many times with scientists. You're a writer yourself, and this has to be something that you've had a great deal of experience with.
Yeah, and for me, it's not just artists or scientists or whatever. All the disciplinary boundaries are sometimes challenging to kind of cross, and I found that I personally have found that persistence is something that can work, but you don't want to bug people too much. If there have been over the years particular people who I've wanted to connect with, who are studying particular things. And usually as a kid, I mean, when I started making my inquiry about trout diversity, it started with just very earnest, humble letters to different people saying, flattery helps too. I love your work. Would you be willing to have a conversation with me? And then sometimes these correspondences would develop into, like, very early on in my research on trout, I met this guy named Fred Kirchis in Maine, who was studying these relict populations of little Arctic char that survived the last glaciation in these lakes. And I went up to try to catch one of these fish. And then I visited Fred, and we gill netted a lake to collect some specimens for his research. And then he invited me on this trip to Kamchatka, Eastern Russia, with a group of fellow biologists that were called the Arctic char fanatics, and they were from all over the world, from different Arctic and near Arctic locations. So a simple correspondence can develop into even a friendship that, you know, where across disciplines you learn so much. You showed some images from the time I spent on a swordfish harpoon boat. You know, I drove from southwestern Connecticut, where I live, up to southern Nova Scotia to try to get on a harpoon boat for swordfish in this town, Woods Harbor. And I just walked out on the dock, and the captain of this boat was unloading some fish, and he asked me what I was there to do, and I said I wanted to paint a life-size swordfish, and I felt the only way I could see that, to do that properly, was to see it when it first came out of the water. And he invited me out on the boat for 7 days. So in some ways I've been very lucky. Maybe people take pity on me or something, but it's these kinds of moments where you step a little bit out of your comfort zone, for me at least, have been very rewarding. So
well, it does seem that you know, one of the things about this intersection is sort of the change of perspective, and it kind of leads to another sort of grouping of questions that we have around, you know, changing perception, changing culture, changing our behavior, which is sort of a common thread that has ran throughout the entire conversation. So I'd like to read to you this one question in part from Tom Skalick, who is online, and who ironically was one of the very first speakers we had for DASERs almost 10 years ago. So Tom writes to ask, would using a massive participatory computer simulation game might allow people to play roles on all sides of the fishing and overfishing issue. Such a game allows polluters and policymakers, fishermen and crabbers, manufacturers and school children to all put themselves in the shoes of another to see how people might make personal decisions about what to catch, eat, produce, and how to live. And of course, in the sort of the larger art science debate, we talk a lot about gaming and sort of its power to change any sort of perception and behavior. I'm wondering if Jennifer, James, if either one of you have an idea. I mean, just sort of, I realize neither one of you may have experience in gaming or simulations, but if you could kind of put yourself in that role, do you think that there would be benefit to this?
Yeah, I don't have much experience with simulations and gaming, but I think any new technology that can be used to get people to see a new perspective would be very valuable. It'd be almost like adding to this discussion another component. I don't know if you could do that with one-day virtual reality, or but it sounds totally viable.
I mean, again, for me, the sort of meta questions become more interesting in a sense that, you know, what perspective do we take in gaming? How does that affect our view of the world? And I know there have been some attempts at a kind of VR experience of factory farming, for instance, that I've heard are very powerful. I myself have not experienced them. But you could imagine, you know, a case where I think probably what would make money is a VR game of catch and release fishing, but maybe the more powerful experience would be what it's like to be the trout in the stream. And can we even imagine what it's like to be a trout in the stream is an interesting question. And I feel like if we don't try to create these simulations, we'll never know how limited our imaginations really are. So I think it's a great effort. It's not something I engage with much personally, though. I mean, I don't know about everyone else during COVID-19, but I'm really eager for the analog myself.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And Jennifer, that's actually sort of the last grouping of questions that I have before we need to end this. It is about sort of maybe is geared towards your question towards the advocacy that you had mentioned earlier, but can we draw parallels between the discussion today and how they intersect with, say, social justice issues, racial justice, and also, just the question of, for both of you, how has the COVID pandemic changed your practice and your perspective? I guess both your perspective and your daily practice. So there's a lot of questions lumped in there too. But again, it's the intersection with other justice issues, as well as the pandemic that we're dealing with. It's basically art and science in the time of crisis, to put a bow on it, so to speak.
Yeah, the intersections are endless. I mean, we have a colleague and I wrote an article on sort of the parallels. Obviously, a lot of people have been doing this between COVID-19 and climate change. When you think about, especially the US approach to both subjects in light of other countries, other democratic countries. So there are lots of parallels, of course, in terms of racial justice, and of course, in terms of global inequality. I mean, you don't have to look far in the fisheries issue to bump up against that. That industrial fisheries are certainly favoring, of course, wealthy countries, and are in fact an arm in many cases of wealthy countries. So there's the intersections really are endless. In the fish pain debate, it's most obvious with the writings of Smith, who published this book, Our Fishes, in 1968, where he actually draws explicit parallels between fish being more primitive and less likely to feel pain than other animals, and Black people feeling less pain than white people. I mean, that's very much a central part of his argument. And so you can see the kind of problematic thinking that underscores a lot of this argumentation right out of the gates. Again, yeah, I'd say the possibilities for studying the ways in which these issues intersect are numerous. And then, of course, a main point of focus, if you look at the headlines on any respectable news outlet, is the factory farming food system, inequality and racial justice, and global pandemics. So we're at a huge, it's been a really interesting time to watch the way that these issues intersect. And in terms of COVID-19 and my own personal experience, I mean, obviously I'm very fortunate to have the job that I do. I am sort of, I'm weirded out like everyone, I think, living their life in 2D on a flat screen, and what that means for how we interact with one another. But taking it day by day and trying to focus on the ways and, the things that you have to be grateful for always, because I feel like, obviously things could always be worse.
James, we've got about a minute left. So how is all this impacting your thoughts and process?
Well, yeah, it's a huge topic, obviously, but, as I mentioned in the beginning, I think one of my main concerns in my work for many years has been the fact that nature is this interconnected system. It's constantly changing. It's sort of messy and tightly interwoven. But when we come to communicate what's essentially a continuum, the evolutionary continuum or the color spectrum, many different things in nature, we have to draw lines between things and say, this is a tree, this is a bird, this is a cow, and things in nature are discrete and separate, but at the same time, they're not. And I feel like the way we communicate the world necessitates that we chop this continuum into neat little boxes. And then once we label the boxes, our brains, I think, evolved to reduce the complexity of the world just in order to get through the day, because we can't absorb the infinite complexity of nature. So we reduce and order nature, we classify nature, we name it. But once we put things in boxes, we as humans, I think, come to defend the walls around the named units, and we forget all the spaces between those named units. So all the issues that are happening currently, I think, are related in that, you know, the virus has, which many, I think most scientists don't even classify as a living thing, has jumped across artificial boundaries that we have created in our minds, you know, from a bat to a civet cat or a pangolin to a human, and is roared through the planet, affecting probably the behavior of almost every living human being. So is the virus even separate from us? One of the comments somebody mentioned, we were talking about city living being apart from nature, but it really isn't. It's humans, wherever they live, are part of nature, and we have to consider it as a holistic, interconnected thing. That the problem with, you know, naming and ordering things is once we put names on things and order things, you know, people try to control those things and keep them in boxes, when really with humanity and with all organisms, we're part of one interconnected system. And I hope that one day we'll be able to transcend some of these boxes that some people seem to hold on to so strongly and defend, and realize that, you know, yeah, it's all connected, and that hopefully we can treat our fellow humans better and our non-human fellows better. And I think that's my goal anyway.
Yeah, well, James, I think that that's sort of a wonderful positive note to end this conversation. The idea that we're all interconnected and we're all in this together, in essence, people and animal alike. Jennifer, James, thank you so much for being a part of this. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that we can continue the conversation. For those of us, those of you joining us, there's a lot of questions about where you can find a recording of this, the chat and everything. If you're registered for this event, you're going to get an email within the next couple of days. That's going to be a survey. It'll also have a link to the video live. We'll also make available the Zoom chat so that if you saw somebody flash by during the introductions that you want to try to learn more about, you'll have that opportunity as well. So many questions that we've received that we didn't get to. And thank you for those. We'll be talking to Jennifer and James about maybe possibly ways of answering some of those more, and we'll share that out as well. Thank you all for being a part of the DASER experiments. And we'll see you next month on the third Thursday of the month. Thank you.
Thanks, JD.
Thank you, JD. Bye, Jennifer.
Bye, James.
Thank you.
Thanks.